our process. I want to talk about Homer. Okay, so I knew about Homer because I met Peter. Peter had introduced me to it, and so I had some idea of its capabilities. Now I have much better. But modeling any electrical grid starts with your user demand, and so we start in with Fort Collins scale data at first. Later we'll get Boulder data. Generation requirements follow the hourly demand. So in other words, if demand goes up, you have to ramp up your turbine. And part of what Homer will do is it will size each component on your grid to make sure that you will be reliable on an hourly basis. It's Boulder company, so I like that local. You know, we got the local smarts here and sort of bring it all together. Came out of NREL. Homer could do minute-by-minute data. We just don't happen to have it. So as far as doing the reliability on a 1 or 15 or 25 or 17.3 minute level, it's really just about what data you can get. And really all we're after with this tool is to account the costs. What's the plant going to cost it's going to generate? What's the fuel it's going to consume cost? And we can do that with spinning reserve requirements that also require us to burn extra in the model to be able to be reliable. It is not a detailed grid design software. Ventix makes a piece of software that costs $100,000 a seat. As a citizens modeling group, we didn't feel like we were going to go buy that tool. What it allows you to do is do that minute-by-minute balancing. And that allows you to do something called regulation. So you can bring in your flywheel storage, you can bring in your service providers that provide regulation services, and you can make sure that you're going to be near 60 hertz on the grid. This doesn't do that. This accounts for load demand hourly, accounts for how much fuel you burn, and really allows us to do cost accounting on an annual basis. So that's, does that answer your question about regulation? Yeah. So when I model solar systems using our engine and our product, we use 8760 data, and it works out just fine matching with what we measure. So, and similarly with photovoltaic systems, you can do exactly that same thing, and I have one in my house and use 8760 data, and it predicts how much I produce on an annual, monthly, daily, and hourly basis extremely well. Okay. I'm going to zip through this. Homer's a lot of features. You define load, you define your resources, oil, natural gas, coal, wind, solar, whatever. You define your generator types. I'm going to use a steam cycle Rankine, I'm going to use a recip, I'm going to use PV. So you put this menu together. Operating reserve requirements. How much extra fossil fuel do you have to have backing up your grid? Even if it's not renewables, you still have to be spinning more on a grid in case demand ramps.
What's Rankine and
Rankine is Rankine cycle, means steam plant. Reciprocating means like a big oil-fired diesel generator. It optimizes. Best thing about Homer. You give it a menu of sizes and different things it can choose from, and costs and fuel consumption, and it goes and it does a gradient descent optimization. What kind? Does several different ones, all very, very, very sexy. And so we end up with least cost mixes at each point, and I'll show you more about that. It performs sensitivity analyses, so it lets you look if gas prices go up, if the wind were not to be as good, if this, if that, if the other, what is my sensitivity to that? So if I can't get the bond rates at 6% or 8%, how much more is the cost of electricity? It also calculates emissions, and the beautiful thing is you can use emissions as a constraint, and you'll see we do that. We say, we want a Boulder grid that's 50% of today's carbon. What's it going to cost? Go optimize, optimize, optimize. Produces some answers. We look at them, sanity check them, and then present them. So I just thought it was a great fit for our purposes. Cost $100 a license. There's a free license if you want to play with it. I encourage everybody to own a copy of Homer.
Unless you're
It's fun.
All right, so let's talk about some of our base case equipment assumptions. We used Excel data once it finally came out. I have the date. I think it came out the 10th of June. We finally got it. So for the 5.5 months between January and June, we used that scaled Fort Collins data. But the good news was Homer is so flexible that we take one data set out from Fort Collins, we drop in the data set that Excel finally provided to that, and then we just hit the re-optimize button. 8 hours later, Homer has presented us with the new least cost grid for this new load that we've got. To start with, we assume that we have to be above Boulder's Peak. You have to be at least 115% above Boulder's Peak. We use 290 because that's what we had before. We just said, look how conservative we are. We're 23% above the annual peak. That's a FERC requirement. We're way above the requirement. Use the current hydro of 12 megawatts peak. That's from the water treatment facilities. Have some hydro plants at them. They're within Boulder's footprint. Boulder now sells that to Xcel. But when those power purchase agreements run out, or whatever the agreements are, that can be delivered to Boulder load. Current solar, 10 megawatt peak. We got that again from solar rewards filings to estimate how much solar is within the Boulder footprint. Then we put on the menu for Homer to choose from 1.5 megawatt peak GE wind turbines. We use Spring Canyon wind data, so we have hour-by-hour resource data for Boulder's sunlight. We know that very well. For the wind out at Spring Canyon at 80 meters hub height, we know that very well, so we've got the turbine efficiencies. And then for out years, for many years in the future, typically is when Homer picks this, there's battery storage. Battery storage is a really great thing because if you've got wind peaking at night when everybody's asleep and their appliances are off, you stuff some of that wind into the batteries, and then later on during the day when the wind is down, use the batteries to back up the grid so you don't have to turn your gas on. Problem is batteries are really pricey, so generally we don't see too many of them. We typically very conservative price estimates for batteries.
Are they, can you ramp the batteries up and down?
Well, I'm not going to get into that right now. I mean,
okay.
Basically, we don't use them. So batteries, everybody loves talk about batteries. You won't see them in most of our cases. When they're cheap, that's when Boulder should invest in them. Right now, batteries are kind of not a player. For operating assumptions, $300 million in startup costs. So for a moment, how do we get that number? $121 million is the best estimate for what it's going to cost to condemn a distribution system. So let's assume you just have to pay for that somehow, whether you're Xcel and you own it, and you have to fund, the operations of it. $300 million in startups. The range we have there, we will present the impact on rates of that entire range tonight. 7% bond interest rates, we think that's easy to get. That's a blended rate between taxable and tax-free bonds. Equipment costs from Xcel's data, 25 years, 15-year or higher operating reserve. And then we have these hourly operating reserves. So in the model, at every hour, you have 7% more electricity available and being produced than you're using. That's the hourly operating reserve. We further have operating reserve if you have wind running. You have to have 60% of that spending. If you have solar running, you have to have 25 spending. This is like ERCOT does. And Peter of Homer said, you guys, if you want to be realistic about what this would look like, if you're not leaning on somebody else's coal or gas or whatever grid, if you want to just look at what Boulder would cost if it did this, you need to put these extra hourly operating reserves, and those are significant drivers. So in reality, we may not have those. And it shows no sales or purchases to or from other parties. Again, that's something that would make this cheaper, but we don't even need to go there. I'll show you why. Okay, let's talk about natural gas. We basically started out with an all natural gas grid. Who wants coal? It's dirty, it's going to be expensive, there's no use for it anymore. It's a fuel of the past. There's nothing good to be said about it. So, but you do have to have something that you can turn up and down and keep the lights on. And so natural gas is that fuel. I wish we didn't have to use any fossil fuels to do this, but we're in a transition period until we get to some nirvana where it's all renewables. So today, natural gas, because its emissions are under half of coal, is what we looked at. This chart is the history of the price of natural gas over the last 10 years. It is a rocky history. And so we felt to be fully responsible in our economic analysis, we would start our base case with the midline here, which happens to be a little more than it's selling for today. You can get gas for a little bit less than this price today, and it could spike. Now the EIA doesn't think so, Xcel does. If you go compare the EIA estimate for gas prices with Xcel's goes up significantly faster.
What's the EIA?
Energy Information Administration. And that's where this is from. I'm sorry, that's a great point, Lynn. This is the Energy Information Administration history of the cost to electric power consumers. So this is our base case that you'll see us talk about a lot, and then this up here is the extreme case that we do a sensitivity out to, just to see.
And are these constant dollars for a given year?
These
If you
are
adjust it for inflation.
that's a great question. I think these are actual dollars in that year. I don't think this is 2009, but that's a really good question.